Today's video on the 472-500 Cadillac motor is about the intake and trying to get it to seal and a couple of minor modifications I do to try and help out. If you're doing a cast iron intake like this one, a factory intake, this is a 425, but either the single plane like this or the dual plane, the cast iron intakes are very rigid and they're designed to run with a valley pan. Now, there's a dowel pin in the head that holds the valley pan in place. And so you just drop the valley pan in, you put the intake in on top of it, you put a little goop on the end maybe, and you install it and you're good to go. If you're doing a stock motor, that's fine. Now, you could run into trouble, and I have seen valley pans. I mean, if you look, this one was getting oil, and it must have been pulling it up around the underneath. I have seen them actually puddled with oil. I have also seen them where they've been sucked up from vacuum leaking at the bottom of the port, and that creates a vacuum in here and crushes the valley pan. So they're not perfect even from the factory. And as you modify a motor or even just rebuild it, you are going to do things like mill the block and mill the head, and that's going to lower all this down a little bit, and that changes how the intake sits. And so if this angle here isn't perfect, then the valley pan won't seal. Now, one of the drawbacks of a valley pan is it doesn't have a lot of give in it. So the question is, why did they run a valley pan? Well, if you look on factory intakes, and we'll flip this one over here, there's an exhaust passage that goes from one head across to the other head. So that means that the bottom of this gets hot, and that's there to warm up the intake so that the fuel vaporizes better. And the problem is it gets hot enough that the oil can actually burn to the bottom of the intake as it splashes up on it. That's why they put a valley pan in, to kind of protect the bottom of the intake from the oil. Not from the heat of the oil, because they're heating the intake, but from letting the oil burn onto the intake. And so if you run gaskets, one thought, I mean, what I've done here is I've blocked off that crossover. So there's no exhaust gas going across it. And yes, that means the intake runs cooler. And in some environments, that could be a bad thing. In what I do, not really so much so. So I don't run the valley pan, and I block it off and run a regular cast iron intake with gaskets. Now, if you're using gaskets, you can do all sorts of things to help out. I mean, in this case, I glued the gasket to the intake, and that helped make sure that it stayed put while I put it together. So that's one thing. And then you'll also notice that I've got some RTV in the dowel pin hole. Because remember, the valley pan uses a dowel pin to hold it in place. Well, that's one of the first things that I make go away. And if you look on the motor here, I've got an early Edelbrock intake sitting on it. And if you'll notice, there is no dowel pin slot in this intake. That's one of the reasons I started making them go away, is that dowel pin can be a problem. Now, you've got to be careful. You don't want to just drive that dowel pin into the head. The reason being is if you look here, see if I can line it up, the dowel pin that sits right here is right in line with that push rod. And so if you drive that dowel pin down into the head, it starts getting mighty close to that push rod, and you don't want it to mess up. So what I've done in the past is drive out the dowel pin and cut one in half, and then put half of it on this side and half of it on this side, so that I have the hole plugged, but there is no dowel pin sticking out. Now in this motor, I didn't do that. I just drove out the dowel pin until it fell out the bottom of the head, and then just put a little bit of really good RTV in the hole so that it didn't seep oil out. And that was partly because this is just a make-it-run motor, so I was trying not to put too much effort into it. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is these bumps. Now, if you look, these bumps are the boss for bolting down the valve cover, and it sticks out beyond where the intake seals. And that's sometimes a problem, depending on the intake. Now, this one isn't sitting too bad, but they start crowding this bolt boss to the point where you have trouble getting the gasket in and you getting the intake on. And it gets worse the more you mill the block and the head. And so you start running into problems hitting this bolt boss and fighting it to get in. Now, the Edelbrock isn't too bad. And plenty of guys have put them on with this boss in place. With gaskets, some guys even manage to get the valley pan to seal. But as you go further on, it gets to be more trouble and depends on each head and each intake. Now, some of the intakes, like the early Boogeyman and the Bulldog intake, they were a lot more bulky up in here, especially the Bulldog intake. It really didn't clear, and guys wind up trying to notch the intake to clear this bolt boss. Well, that seemed really silly to me. I didn't see why I was doing that. And so what I started doing was taking a 4-inch flapper wheel and cutting the boss off and making it flush. Now, I work from this side. You don't want to run the flapper wheel across the sealing surface because you don't want to mess up the sealing surface. You're just slowly working your way down to about where the intake is to take that boss off and just make it flush with the sealing surface. Now, if you look, there are no threads exposed. All it did was take a flat out of instead of having a bump, it's a bit of a flat there. And it doesn't affect how the valve cover seals because the seal is across here and it still has the seal in here. So basically you've got the same sort of sealing area that you would have had anyway. So it doesn't affect the valve cover seal at all, but it gives you a lot of breathing room to not have to worry about that bump. It also gives you a lot of breathing room to not have to worry about the dowel pin. And so by eliminating those two problems, it makes it way easier to get an intake on. And like I said, I prefer gaskets so that it has more give. They're thicker and they're cushy instead of the rigid of the valley pan. And so that gives you some give if this angle here isn't perfect. Because it's one thing to rely on it with a factory intake that's been on a motor and does pretty well, as opposed to an aftermarket intake where you're not really certain if they milled this angle exactly dead on to where it was supposed to be. And even if it's just a little bit, you can wind up with a gap at either the top or the bottom that doesn't seal well on a valley pan. And then on top of that, an aluminum intake tends to imprint. The aluminum is softer than the steel valley pan technically, and so it will not get quite the clamp force that you would normally get with the nice rigid cast iron intake. And so I find that running a gasket is a much better choice in trying to get this to seal. Now again, you have to decide on the crossover passage, because even the Edelbrock has that passage on the bottom. Now, with aluminum intakes, they tend to run warmer. A lot of times, if you have this crossover, the intake actually runs too hot. And so you can run into troubles, especially if you live in a hot environment. And so I usually block them off. The intake in aluminum will get warmer than one in cast iron just because it tends to absorb the thermal energy from the motor better. So it gets warmer sooner and it tends to run just fine. Now, I do live in a warm environment, so I don't have to worry a lot about winter. If you are in somewhere that, real cold is a problem, then you got to think twice about what you're doing over here. But for me, I just block the crossover and use a gasket, and like I said, mill these off so that they're not in my way, and get rid of the dowel pin in order to make this go on easier. And the same with the standard thing about the end seal is, if you look here, there isn't a big gap there. The problem, depending on how they cast this may be sitting down. And then again, you mill this and you mill this intake is moving down. So this gap gets thinner and thinner. So I tend to find the cork to be too thick to fit in there, and it'll squirm out. And so I've just used a nice good quality RTV and a bead at each end on what people sometimes call the China rail in order to get it to seal and not have oil seeping out. So I'm blocking the heat crossover using gaskets, getting rid of the dowel pin, and milling off these bosses in order to make the intake way easier to just put on. And I don't have to worry about a lot of fighting it. And there are guys that have dropped them on, not had any trouble. It all depends on the intake and the engine and how those little bosses were cast. But you'll also run across quite a few guys that have fought them. And with the Bulldog intake, I have really fought them. That's when I finally gave up, and just every head I do, when I prep it, I just mill these off so they're not there, and I can do as I please with an intake and not run into troubles. So that's just a quick video on what I do to try and help the intake get on and seal without fighting it too much. And something you might consider if you're prepping ahead, you might consider eliminating these, not necessarily on the motor, but if you have the head out and you're already doing other stuff, it only takes a couple of minutes with a 4-inch flapper wheel to pull those things off and get them out of the way. And you don't have to go crazy. You just want to kind of make it flush. And so that's just a quick video on what I do to try and help intakes go on and off easy and let me play instead of fighting to get a gasket to tuck underneath one of those bumps, or to get the intake to go down, or having to pull the intake back off and notch it, and I hate that idea. And so just a quick video to show you what I do in order to make it work. And I think it's a good idea. It works really well. I'm going to say one more quick thing before I go, just because the question comes up so often. But the question is, what's this hole? Should the gasket cover that hole? And the answer is no. That hole is an air vent. It goes nowhere. Its purpose, if you look, you have exhaust gas coming up to this crossover. And it's right here in the head. And if that was right there, just like we talked about oil burning on the bottom of the intake, well, oil would start burning right here underneath the valve cover. So in order to not have that happen, they put a little air gap in between. So as the exhaust heats up underneath here, it just heats up the air and the air escapes out. And this part in here doesn't get hot enough to burn the oil. So everything works just fine. Like I said, this is just a little air gap in order to stop you from burning oil in the head. So anyway, that was just a little quick extra because it seems to come up often enough. Good luck with what you're working on. I'll talk to you later. Bye.